Okay, so photosynthesis is just the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. So we as people can't go suntan and get the energy we need to perform all of the tasks in our body. We have to eat things that have either laid in the sun and converted light energy to chemical energy, or eaten something that is laid in the sun and converted light energy into chemical energy. So basically, all life on Earth is solar powered. Either directly or indirectly. So there's a couple of terms that we'll talk about. This is a great big concept, that all of this energy that is going through our biospheres to keep all of the living things alive originates from the sun. So those that are directly solar powered, they are what are called autotrophs. So what does that word auto mean in like Latin prefixes and suffixes? An autobiography is what?
It's written by the author.
It's written by the author. So auto means self. So like a self-biography is a biography about yourself. And so an autotroph is self-feeding. So whenever you think of trough, think of like a food trough. That Latin word trough means feeding. So autotrophs are self-feeding. So they sustain themselves without eating anything derived from living things. So they use non-living things to sustain their energy. They literally build organic molecules from CO2. So if you remember, hold on, my phone's vibrating. I don't know who's trying to call me from Cave City, Arkansas, but I don't want it. Okay. So if you remember from 10th grade, I think I started the photosynthesis unit out with, where does the mass of a plant come from? So you start with a little bitty seed, or we'll think bigger, so like an acorn, and that grows into an oak tree. And so how do you go from an acorn, little bitty acorn, to an oak tree? All of that mass comes from just building on these molecules from CO2. So it's a reaction that just builds up all of the carbon from that CO2 and is able to use it to have all complete and build all of the mass that is the plant. And then we eat that mass for energy. I'm going to put that this is most plants. So not all plants, just for some do a little bit of both. So like, can you think of an example of a plant that doesn't just do photosynthesis? That might get some energy from organic matter. Have you ever heard of a Venus flytrap? So there are things like a Venus flytrap, and then there's another, it's like a tropical flower that's kind of shaped like a bell. I think it's actually called a bellflower. I don't really know. Anyways, but inside of that bell and inside of the Venus flytrap are these little enzymes that break down things like flies or small bugs, things like that. And they can actually use some of that organic matter. But those are few and far between. most all of the plants on our planet are autotrophs. So, can you think of what, I can't spell indirectly. Can you think of the word for things that might get their energy outside of other organic things? So not by themselves. If auto means self, what's the word for other? Hetero. So hetero means other, troph means feeding. So other feeding. So they live off of compounds produced by other organisms. These are known as consumers because they are consuming the things in the biosphere. These are your producers. So consumers rely on the organic matter from producers to stay alive. Now, most things are consuming actual living organisms. So whether you're consuming that living spinach that literally could still actively photosynthesize if you put it out in the sun, those cells are still living. If you're actively eating something that's living, you're a direct consumer. There are things that use organic matter that's non-living. These are called decomposers. So they feed on non-living organic matter. So basically, after it's no longer like reproducing or anything like that, this is like leaf litter. Hold on, and I'll move this up. So this is like fungus, worms, things like that will actually break down materials that are used to be living but aren't living anymore. Excuse me. So heterotrophs are not only dependent on photosynthesis for energy, but what else do you think they need photosynthesis for? What do things that photosynthesize give off as a byproduct?
CO2.
No, they use CO2. They give off. What do we breathe in?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Good job. Okay. So heterotrophs depend on autotrophs for energy and oxygen. And we'll talk about the reaction here in just a second. Okay, so photosynthesis has two reactions in like the whole process. Does anyone remember what those two reactions are? Any takers? Going once? Going twice? Okay. So there is the light reaction. This is the photo part. And then there is the Calvin cycle, which is the synthesis part. The light reaction happens first, and then there's the Calvin cycle. So this whole overview of a reaction, I'm going to draw this out in a second, and then we'll break it down and actually figure out where everything's coming from, is a pretty straightforward reaction. And if I'm going too fast at any point in time, you just stop me. So the overview of it is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus light gives you C6H12O6 and 6O2. You will see that after we're done with photosynthesis, which that'll be this week, and then we'll have Thanksgiving break, when we come back, we will talk about cellular respiration. And you'll see that when we talk about cellular respiration, it is the exact opposite. So except minus the light. It doesn't give off light energy. It just gives off energy in the form of heat. But we break that glucose down with a reaction using oxygen and give off CO2 and water. So it's really, really cool after we learn these two concepts and then put them all together, how that great big cycle actually works. So photosynthesis takes CO2 and water and the energy from the sunlight and gives you glucose and oxygen. If we simplify, so I don't know if you ever did this in chemistry, but you can, when you're following atoms, you can break these down. So like, you know that 6 CO2, 6 H2O, 6 O2, they have that common denominator of 6. And you can simplify this too. So I'll show you how. So you divide everything by 6. You've got CO2 plus H2O plus light gives you and the brackets here, they represent that this is not a complete sugar, but it is the base molecules. So every single sugar, every carbohydrate always has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And so it's just showing that this is like the base of that if you're simplifying it. So whenever this reaction was figured out by scientists, so it's been a long time, but whenever it was first figured out, they thought if you just look at this reaction, you might think, okay, that carbon dioxide is split apart and the carbon's being built up on top of the water and the oxygen's given off. That's what kind of, when you look at this reaction, makes the most sense. It's just a little rearrangement. Well, scientists figured out from an experiment that it was actually water that was being split. So in that first photo part, the light reaction, water is literally being split to build up a ion. So to build up a bunch of ions from splitting that water. And so I'll tell you, number one, how that was found and then what that movement of atoms looks like, because it's really important to understand that before we go into the nitty-gritty of these actual reactions. So, like I said, scientists wanted to figure out where is the oxygen coming from and where is the sugar coming from. And so what scientists did, and it was this Van Niel guy. So Van Niel used sulfur fixating, which just means they use sulfur instead of oxygen, bacteria to test where oxygen comes from. in photosynthesis. So basically, this sulfur bacteria does the same reaction as photosynthesis, just instead of oxygen, they use sulfur. So the bacteria, the reaction simplified. So basically, the oxygen here, they use sulfur instead, so hydrogen dihydrogen sulfide instead of dihydrogen oxide or H2O. And they got sugar, water, and sulfur by itself. So they still got water as a byproduct, even though they didn't put water into that reaction. So if you break that down to photosynthesis, CO2 plus 2H2O, and then we'll generalize it. And then I'll draw this out to show you what I mean here. So that X represents anything that you would substitute that with. You would always get sugar, water, and then 2 of that. So you can see this shows that they're splitting that molecule to give you sugar and water instead of using the CO2. CO2 stays intact. We'll just ignore that. That's just being built upon. But they are splitting this part right here to get the oxygen. I know. Draw it out like this and see if this helps bring that home. So if this is your reactants, draw our products. We're going to make this just a little more linear. So instead of drawing it side by side, we're doing it up and down, and I'm gonna color code this really quickly. So basically the carbon from this is going here, and the oxygen is going here and here. While the water, the hydrogens are going here and here, and the oxygen is coming here. So that oxygen, instead of coming from carbon dioxide, is coming from the water. And again, it's important that we follow these atoms because basically that carbon dioxide isn't used in the first part of the reaction. In that first part of the reaction, all we're using is water. So basically, what's the job of water in photosynthesis? And it's not just to give off more water. It is to give off oxygen. So we'll break that down in a second. Hold on, there's a chat. Let me look at that real quick. Not really sure. Okay. Thank you, Julia. Okay. Does everyone get what I'm saying here? That basically the water is being split to give you the hydrogen for that water and then the oxygen. So again, you'll see why understanding this is important in just a second. Because again, carbon dioxide doesn't even come into the play until after the light reaction is completely done. Light reaction only uses water. And so it's important to understand what the purpose of that light reaction is. Okay. So let's figure that out. Is everyone good on this? Can I move on or do I need to slow down?
Can you slow down just a second?
Yeah, I'll give it a sec.
Okay.
Thank you. Definitely don't want to move too fast. Now, okay. Are we good to go on? Okay. I'm just going to leave that part up in case anyone's still copying that down. Okay. So first we will talk about the first step of photosynthesis, and that is the light reaction. So there are a few things that's happening. Water is split. Providing H plus and giving off oxygen. And then light absorbed by chlorophyll transfers those electrons and H plus to acceptor, which that acceptor molecule is called NADP plus. And once it has those electrons, it's NADPH. And then lastly, ATP is produced from chemiosmosis, which sounds like a great big word. We know osmosis is just the movement of water, and this is basically attaching chemicals to it. So it is the movement of chemicals with water across a membrane. And we'll break that down. Chemiosmosis also happens in cellular respiration, so this isn't the first time you'll see it. So these three main things are happening in this reaction. Now, in the Calvin cycle. There's what's called carbon fixation. So uses CO2 as basically a building base. And then uses electrons, H plus, and ATP from light reaction converting CO2 to carbohydrate. So this is like the huge overview of photosynthesis. First step being the light reaction, second step being the Calvin cycle. I'll give you all a second to write those down. We'll draw it out, and then we'll take a little bit of a break before we talk about wavelengths of light and why they're absorbed at certain wavelengths and all of that good stuff. Okay. If you're wanting to color code, you might want to get your colored pencils or pens or something out. I'm going to color code this picture just to make everything really clear. Is everyone good on this, or do I need to keep it up? Tell me if I'm going too fast. Okay. So this is a photosynthesis overview. All of this is happening, like we said earlier, in the chlorophyll. Oh, sorry, chloroplast. My bad. So inside of this chloroplast, there are these extra membranes. So of course we've got one membrane out here, and then inside it's actually double membrane. And then inside is an actual third membrane system, and it's in these little stacks. Each of these little bubble parts here is called a thylakoid. And then the stack of thylakoid is called a grana, or granum, if you're talking about multiples. Or I've got that opposite. It's granum for single, grana for multiples. And then the liquid inside is called the stroma. So this is just some language because reactions either happen in the thylakoids, and then the Calvin cycle actually happens in the stroma. So I'll draw that out. So inside of this is what is doing the light reaction. So basically, and we'll talk about this, but these thylakoids, which are green pigments, got a green pigment to it called chlorophyll. That's why I got confused up there. But that green pigment can trap certain wavelengths of light and then use those to do this reaction. So what's going into this part is, of course, light. H2O. And I'm drawing that in the same color for a reason, because as we saw earlier, the oxygen comes from the splitting of that oxygen, or of that water. And then you get ATP. And NADPH. So this is step one. The light reaction uses light, splits water, gives off oxygen. When it splits that water, all of those hydrogen ions that have electrons attached to them are transferred either to ATP through chemiosmosis or to NADPH. And then you've got step two, which is the Calvin cycle. This happens in the stroma, so it's happening outside of this thylakoid. Okay. You've got CO2. And again, I'm drawing this in the same color because CO2 is what's being built upon to build your sugar. You're using this NADPH, the hydrogens that have built up there, and your ATP. And so you give off basically the building materials that are needed in the light reaction. And I'm trying to stay consistent with the colors here. And then those reactions are used in the light reaction again to build all of that up. And all of this, well, yes, this is the Calvin cycle. All of this whole concept is a cycle. So every time there is light and water available to the plant, it will always be converted to O2. That energy is transferred to NADPH and ATP. So that's what it's talking about, converting solar energy to chemical energy. That's what's happening in this step. It's converting that to chemical energy. And then you turn that energy into matter by using CO2, building up sugar. In that process, obviously, you have to use the energy that's been conjured in the first step. And so once that energy is used, those byproducts, the ADP and inorganic phosphate and NADP plus that are the building blocks that are needed to do this, go back into this reaction. So all of this is recycled over and over and over again. The only thing that's not recycled is the sunlight. Once it's transferred to that matter, then it goes on and is used. So like that's used by the plant to either build up as matter and like build onto, you know, a tree branch. Once that a tree branch is a bad example. So corn, we eat corn. So it's being used to build up into that corn stalk. And then if we eat that corn stalk, we break it down to make more ATP for us to use. That's cellular respiration that we'll talk about. But the byproduct of that is heat. So like we're putting off heat into the environment. So basically that light energy, eventually after it goes through its process of living things, then it is given off in the form of heat. That's why whenever you put too much sunlight into an atmosphere or don't have enough of this going on to absorb that sunlight, and there's an overproduction of CO2 from cellular respiration, or that CO2 is not being absorbed enough, that's when you've got issues of imbalances, because light's going to keep coming into our atmosphere whether we use it or not. And if it's not used, it creates issues because it gives it off as heat. And that is bad. Does this make sense? Okay. I'm going to leave this up and we're going to take, it's 12:39. We're going to take a 5-minute break. 12:45 is when we'll come back and talk about wavelengths and the light that's being absorbed and all of that good stuff. Okay, so I've got 12:45. If no one has any questions about this overview, then we'll talk about a little more specifics about the light reaction. Okay, so that light reaction obviously uses light, but we have to kind of think about what is light and how does this reaction use it. So all light is the science of sunlight. So all light is wavelengths. So there are wavelengths that are visible to us and there are wavelengths that are not visible to us. I'll go over those in a second. But all it is a wavelength. So basically you've got energy that is in this pattern wave. And from here to here is a wavelength. Like I said, of that visible wavelengths, it has to be a certain wavelength. If it gets, too skinny and those wavelengths become shorter and shorter, or if it spreads it out even more, and those wavelengths become longer and longer, it goes out of the spectrum of our visible light. So our visible light spectrum is from 380 nanometers to 750 nanometers. So this is like the lights that are in a rainbow. So you can remember Rujubiv. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That's the spectrum of what we can see, with red being the lowest wavelength and violet being the highest wavelength. Excuse me. Sorry, lowest energy, sorry. I can see how that would be confusing because the wavelengths with this are shorter wavelengths, not larger. So I could see that being confused with higher. Sorry. So had to take a second and rephrase. So violet is highest energy, shortest wavelength. And red is lowest energy, longest wavelength. And this is, again, just visible light. So of the light we can see, violet, it has the most energy, is the shortest wavelength. So it's like that. This is lowest energy, longest wavelength. So it's more like that. And it kind of makes sense because obviously if you've got shorter wavelengths, you're going to have more of that energy compacted. Think of it like a spring. So if you've got a spring that's, real tightly packed, it's going to give off more energy whenever you release that spring. If the spring's not very tightly packed, whenever you release that spring, it's not going to have very much energy to it. Like I said, there's wavelengths outside of what the human eye can see. So like less than 380. So that means the wavelengths are shorter. They have higher energy. Shorter wavelengths. These are like UV rays, X-rays, gamma rays. So we can't see ultraviolet rays. We can't see the energy that's coming from the sun that can harm our cells, but it's still there. We just can't visualize it. It doesn't have a color assigned to it because it's not visual. I am standing. My watch is telling me to stand and I'm standing. Okay. Same with x-rays. When you go get an x-ray done, you can't see the wavelength of those photons that are penetrating and bouncing off of your bones, and you're able to see that in a picture. If it is, excuse me, greater than 750, so lower energy, longer wavelengths, these are things like infrared, microwaves that cook your food, and radio waves. So that's why when you're listening to a radio, there can be static, or those radio waves can be intercepted, because there's, a lot of length in between there to intercept it. There are some animals that can see infrared waves. Snakes, for instance, they can see infrared waves, so they can actually kind of see whenever it said that they have like heat vision, that's what it's saying, is that it can see the infrared rays that are given off of a animal as they, emit this heat energy. That's infrared. So out of the light spectrum, so the light reaction can absorb visible light, but light is either reflected, transmitted, or absorbed. So this concept is what you're going to have to understand to be able to do the assignment that I just posted. So, well, first, does anyone have any questions over this? Just anything about visible light, what's visible, what's non-visible? Nope. Okay. So, when light meets matter, it is either reflected, an F, transmitted, or absorbed. A pigment is matter that absorbs visible light. So we talked about how the chloroplast in a tree, or in a tree, but in all plants that do photosynthesis and anything that does photosynthesis, how it has this pigment called chlorophyll. So it actually has chlorophyll. It's called alpha, but you can just do chlorophyll A. And then it's got chlorophyll B and what's called carotenoids. And it's funny because these are called carotenoids because they reflect a certain color. So chlorophyll A is the primary light-catching pigment, and it absorbs violet and red light. So it basically absorbs both ends of the spectrum. It absorbs red light, which is lower energy, and then it absorbs violet light, which is super high energy. So if it absorbs violet and red, that is why it reflects green. that is why it looks green. So like if you see here, it absorbs red and violet, and so what's left is green in the middle. I'll show you a picture in your book here in just a second and kind of give you a better visual, obviously, since I don't have like rainbow colors right in front of me. Chlorophyll B and carotenoids, they absorb blue. They don't absorb as much of that red. They absorb some red. And so they reflect orange and yellow. Chlorophyll B and carotenoids are what are used whenever light rays start changing. So like the reason that in the summer or in months where the sun is, quite frankly, closer, then it's able to absorb more violet and red lights. Whenever that changes, whenever our seasons are changing, so like the orientation of the sun to our planet is actually different in our area, then the plants use these secondary chlorophylls to absorb that light, and it doesn't absorb as much of that red light. And so that is why you get that orange yellow color of the leaves, because it's actually using a different pigment to absorb that light. Still photosynthesizing. A common question is, okay, well, when the leaves fall off, are they photosynthesizing? And the answer to that is no. So any growth that happens in a tree or anything like that in the winter is from leftover or built up materials that they haven't used for chemical reactions yet, like cellular division. But there is a certain point of time where they will stop. That's why whenever you cut a tree, you can do the years of growth. And that's because as those cells start dividing less and less, because they're running out of energy to divide because it's the winter and they're not photosynthesizing, those cells will get darker and darker, and that's why it creates those little rings. And then it'll start the new growth whenever they grow their leaves, and they can photosynthesize again, and it'll have a good, big chunk of growth, and then it'll be another line, and then it'll be a chunk of growth, and you see what I'm saying. So it's actually really interesting, I think, the way that plants have adapted. Okay. So I'm going to show you this thing in the book, and then I'll talk about the assignment. But does this make sense? That whenever light is absorbed, it's going to reflect the light that's not absorbed. That's a big concept that you need to understand for this assignment. If it reflects a certain light, that means it absorbs the other light in the spectrum. So this shows you, I'm going to zoom in real quick. Okay. So this shows you the spectrum of visible light. So from lower wavelength, or from shorter wave, from longer wavelengths to shorter wavelengths. So chlorophyll A is obviously the most efficient because it's absorbing at the highest wavelength, aka the highest energy. So it's able to absorb light whenever it's giving off the most energy. It doesn't absorb it past this indigo here. And then it bumps back up here at this red to orange. So this spectrum is what you get whenever chlorophyll A is active, what you see. So what is being reflected? This is being absorbed, this is being reflected. Now you can see chlorophyll B and carotenoids. So chlorophyll B, it's not able to absorb very much at all. And whenever it does, it's more on the blue side. So you can even have some reflection, a little bit of purple. It doesn't happen often, but you've all seen it in oak trees where they kind of have that purpley red hue to them. That's probably because they're mainly functioning off of chlorophyll B or carotenoids. And so it absorbs this. Carotenoids aren't even down here at all. So they only absorb this spectrum. They don't absorb any past this. So you've got all of this array of colors that are visible, that are being reflected. Again, whatever's being absorbed is non-visible to the human eye because it's being absorbed, And then what's being reflected is what we see. Does that make sense? So that's why your leaves change colors, is this right here. Okay. Let me change my camera back. And I'm going to screen share and show you the assignment. So I wasn't able to find it on AP College Board, but that's fine because it's probably easier to just be able to use it on the Google Classroom. Words are hard today, guys. Let me show you screen share. Sorry, my computer's loading. Okay. So it's called photosynthesis and light absorption. So it's just about the concept that we just talked about. It's a Google Doc. Each of you have a copy, so you can edit it as you please. But once that loads, it shows you these light spectrums. So it shows you the absorption of wavelengths. And then it also gives you like the wavelengths and the colors that they give off. So instead of like where the graph in the book has the colors below them, this just has it in a separate table. So it shows you this graph and then basically asks you some questions. So it says an absorption spectrum indicates the relative amount of light absorbed across a range of wavelengths. The graph shows the absorption spectrum of individual pigments isolated from two different organisms, one being chlorophyll A, and then the other is a bacteriophodopsin, which you don't have to know how to say that word, but it's a photosynthetic bacteria. So it's having you look at those graphs and identify basically which one is absorbing what wavelength, which one you think goes with which graph 1 or graph 2. And then it's got a little bit of a connection question. So it says this bacteriophodopsin has been found in aquatic organisms whose ancestors existed before ancestors of plants evolved in the same environment. Propose a possible evolutionary history of plants that could have resulted in a predominant photosynthetic system that uses only some of the colors of the visible light spectrum. So that's just having you think, okay, why would they evolve to only use a certain light spectrum? So it's a little bit of a connection question. My main thing is that you understand how to answer 1 and 2. So if you will go ahead and start on that, I will, where'd it go? There we go. I set the due date for today, so barring any crazy circumstances, you should be able to get done with it. It shouldn't take more than like 15, 20 minutes. And then once you turn that in, you are done for the day. I'm also going to stop recording. Okay.